forth. Now, panel, what historical artifact will make the news next? Tom Papa.
As seas continue to rise, we're bringing back Noah's Ark.
Dulce Sloan.
Kim Kardashian wore Marilyn Monroe's dress, Lizzo played James Madison's crystal flute, and RuPaul will wear Thomas Jefferson's wig to the MTV Music Awards.
And Hari Kondabolu.
Tucker Carlson will wear Christopher Marlowe's codpiece, and there will still be room.
Well, if any of that happens, Crandall will ask you about it on Wait, Don't Tell Me.
Thank you, Bill Curtis. Thanks also to Tom Papa, Dulce Sloan, and Hari Kondabolu. Thanks to our fabulous audience here at the Studebaker. Thanks to all of you for listening at home. I'm Peter Sagal. We'll see you next week. This is NPR.
You are listening to Georgia Public Broadcasting at 11 o'clock on this Saturday morning. I'm Leah Fleming. It is great to have you along. Stay with us for Freakonomics Radio. That's up next right here on GPB and streaming at gpb.org.
Manatees are seriously threatened by human activity, but they've also come to depend on one of the main drivers of climate change, fossil fuel power plants.
You looked up and all you saw was shoulder-to-shoulder menses in the discharge canal.
On the next Planet Money, how manatees got into hot water. And on How I Built This, we meet a man who left Adidas to found a biodegradable streetwear brand. That's on the next Planet Money and How I Built This from NPR.
It all starts this afternoon at 4 on GPB.
From the Armstrong campus of Georgia Southern University, this is WSVH and WSVH HD Savannah and WWIO and WWIO HD Brunswick.
This is Freakonomics Radio, the show that explores the hidden side of everything, with your host, Stephen Dubner.
Today on Freakonomics Radio, the pandemic shifted much of our lives online, including religion.
Over the last 12 months, Pray.com has facilitated nearly 1 billion minutes in prayer.
But this commingling of religion and commerce is nothing new.
Suddenly it became a way of not just collecting some money, but immense amounts of money.
What are people on apps like Pray.com praying for?
Stephen, I can tell you that prayer tends to boil down to 2 simple things. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and help me, help me, help me.
And when you pray to God online, who else is listening?
People don't read their privacy policies exhaustively.
That's coming up on Freakonomics Radio right after this hour's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Nora Rahm. In Florida, days after Hurricane Ian, flooding continues and is getting worse in some communities on the Gulf Coast. NPR's Greg Allen reports the flooding has forced the closure of a major artery, Interstate 75.
Authorities closed a 14-mile section of the interstate because of flooding caused by the Miaka River. The headwaters of the river received more than 15 inches of rain from Hurricane Ian. The river is already 2 feet over its flood stage and won't crest until Saturday afternoon. Flooding from the Miaka has brought new headaches to neighborhoods in Northport and surrounding communities in Charlotte County. Neighborhoods that escaped flooding from Ian's storm surge now are getting it from the river. National Guard troops have been stationed in the area and are using high water vehicles to take people to safety. The National Weather Service has issued flood warnings for residents who live near the Miaka and several other rivers swollen by Ian's heavy rain. Greg Allen, NPR News, St. Petersburg.
Ian struck South Carolina yesterday. The National Hurricane Center expects the storm, no longer a hurricane, will bring treacherous conditions to parts of Virginia and West Virginia today. In Las Vegas today, survivors and family members of victims are gathering to remember the 60 people killed and hundreds wounded 5 years ago today in the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. NPR's Eric Westervelt reports.
Much of the area where the killing occurred is now overflow parking for Raiders games. A sign says a memorial is coming. When is unclear.
Now there's a football parking lot where people were murdered. It's horribly upsetting.
Bartender Heather Goose was working the festival that night. For hours, she stayed beside people who were dead or dying, holding one stranger's hand. Goose calls her friendships with fellow survivors the only silver lining.
I honestly don't know if a lot of us would have survived the last 5 years if it wasn't for the family that we made because of the tragedy that happened.
This weekend, Goose will spend time with her survivor family, including the mother of one of the strangers she stayed with that night as he lay mortally wounded. Eric Westervelt, NPR News, Las Vegas.
A report by Iran's official news agency says an attack by armed separatists in southeastern Iran today left 19 people dead, including 4 members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. NPR's Peter Kenyon reports.
The unidentified assailants opened fire on a police station in the city of Zahidam. The provincial governor tells state media, in addition to the dead, the attack wounded nearly 36 Revolutionary Guard members. There was no immediate connection made between this attack and the nationwide anti-government protests that have rocked the country following the death of a young woman in the custody of Iran's so-called morality police. The Sistan and Baluchistan province has been the scene of previous attacks on security forces. Peter Kenyon, NPR News, Istanbul.
This is NPR News from Washington. Russian officials say they've withdrawn their troops from the city of Liman in the northeastern part of the country. The city is considered crucial for both sides and is a major railway hub. This would be the first major city retaken in the Donetsk region since Russian President Vladimir Putin declared yesterday that Donetsk is part of Russia. Condemnations are pouring in against yesterday's military coup in Burkina Faso, the second just this year. The United Nations has expressed concern and appealed for calm. Ishma Fandikwa reports.
After military officers announced that they had taken over, some Burkinabe, exasperated with the ousted government's failure to improve the security situation in the country, demonstrated in support of the latest coup. They also called on the new leaders to follow Mali's lead and invite Wagner, the Russian mercenary group, to help fight the Islamic insurgents operating across the Sahel. Mali has taken delivery of Russian military hardware in previous months. In Burkina Faso, thousands have died and about 2 million have been displaced by the fighting between the militants and security forces since 2015. For NPR News, I am Ishma Fundikwa in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe.
Train workers are on strike in Britain, disrupting rail transportation. It's the latest strike in a year of labor unrest in Britain, as inflation and rising energy costs outpace any pay raises. Network Rail says that only about 11% of trains are operating today. I'm Nora Rahm, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Jarl and Pamela Mohn, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts. And the Public Welfare Foundation, committed to advancing transformative youth and criminal justice reforms.
I will throw out the first question to you, Stephen. What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning?
Well, if we're being literal, it's turning off the alarm.
So for me, I pray. And for billions of people around the world, if you ask them that question, billions of people would also respond that they pray too.
That is Steve Gattina.
And I am the founder and CEO of Pray.com, the world's #1 app for daily prayer and faith-based audio content.
For most of his life, Gattina himself was not someone you would consider a person of faith. Back when he played college football, for instance.
You might hit people when they're not looking. You might intentionally try to hurt people physically. Those were some of the qualities that I enjoyed embracing. And I would say off the field, I loved having a lot of fun.
This was at the University of Southern California.
At the time, USC was basically the pro football team in Los Angeles. You're out in Hollywood, you're at nightclubs till 5 in the morning. I would say that it was definitely not a lifestyle that promotes Christian values.
But years later, Gattina did become more religious. By then, he was a successful entrepreneur, and he saw what looked like a market opportunity.
Religion is approximately $126 billion in revenue per year.
And the pandemic, with so much activity moving online, presented another opportunity.
Over the last 12 months, Pray.com has facilitated over 122 million prayers for nearly $1 billion
2016, venture capital firms invested around $6 million in faith-based apps, most of them Christian. In the world of venture capital, $6 million is essentially zero. 4 years later, they spent $50 million on religious apps. Last year, $175 million. Why such a spike? One reason was a demand for online religion induced by COVID-19 shutdowns.
Yes, very much.
This is Jeanette Benson.
And I'm an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen.
Her specialty is the economics of religion.
So that means examining why some societies are more religious than others and how this influences society as a whole.
A lot of the statistics we hear about religiosity come from survey and census questionnaires. That's how the Pew Research Center assembles their data. And they say that worldwide, more than 8 in 10 people identify with a religious group. Nearly a third of the global population, or 2.2 billion people, identify as Christian. There are 1.6 billion Muslims, or 23%, 1 billion Hindus, or 15%, roughly 500 million Buddhists, 400 million people who practice folk or traditional religions, and about 14 million Jews. That said, when someone tells the Pew researchers that they identify with a religious group, that doesn't necessarily tell you much about participation. So how does an economist like Benson measure religious activity?
We can, for example, measure how often people go to church. We can ask them how much they pray, but we can also look at how much they Google religious terms.
And that's what Benson was doing in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic.
I think it was actually March 10th, and I had been looking at the numbers, and at that date there was nothing in the numbers yet. But I checked in a week later. I could see that Google searches for religious terms really started to rise at that point.
The religious terms Benson is talking about were searches like prayers to end COVID and prayers to thank essential workers.
The first month of the pandemic, it rose more than 30% and stayed higher throughout 2020.
And it stayed high through the period of your research, is that true?
Yes, it did. Yes, not as high as in the beginning, but 10% higher than usual, and it's still higher than ever before. It rose, 1.3 times the rise in searches for takeaway, which of course rose quite a bit. It rose 12% the rise in Netflix searches, and it rose 26% the fall in searches for flights, which was all closed down. So it's huge. It's all types of countries, rich and poor.
Do you consider yourself a religious person?
No.
Do you think it gives you an advantage, a disadvantage, or no impact whatsoever that you are a non-religious person studying the economics of religion?
I hope it doesn't matter whatsoever. I think it has given me a passion to try to understand.
Now, there is a lot of research showing that religious belief and participation are associated with a lot of positive things, better health outcomes, and so on. Can you tell us anything about how causal those relationships are, or is that a case of selection?
So there's not that many good studies on the impact of religion or prayer on mental health. And yes, some of them are just correlational, but there's also been studies doing experiments. For example, a study that had some people say, I am love, for example, in their meditation, and the other one say, God loves me, or I am God, or something like that. They claimed the spiritual meditation was more beneficial to certain health outcomes.
Historically, one key component of religion is its sociality. Religion is something we do with our families, our communities, our fellow believers, and COVID affected this.
It is quite clear that however good Zoom and Facebook and other internet forms of connection are, they are a far cry from face-to-face. We've seen this in education, and I think we're seeing it in religion.
That's Larry Iannacone, another economist who studies religion. He is at Chapman University in California.
I had a very strong religious upbringing, and I would call myself a person of faith, but I would also hasten to add that the kind of work I do is first and foremost an attempt to understand this profoundly important phenomenon.
To understand religion requires an understanding of cause and effect, what's causing what. And Iannacone says the social component of religion is a causal mechanism.
We know from countless studies now that faith tends to follow, not precede, involvement. Congregations are sustained, religions are sustained, faiths of all kind are sustained through social interactions. COVID shut this down for a long time.
The U.S., as you likely know, is an unusually religious country. Unusual because most wealthy countries tend to be less religious. Jeanette Benson again.
If we just put GDP per capita out one axis and religiosity up the other, well, then we see in general a negative correlation.
Meaning what exactly?
Poorer countries are more religious and a richer country are less religious. But yes, the US is a huge outlier.
But even in the U.S., religiosity has been declining. In 1944, when Gallup first surveyed Americans on whether they believe in God, 96% said yes. By 2017, that number was down to 87%. By 2022, 81%, a record low. Gallup also found that membership in houses of worship has fallen below 50%, another record low.
When you talk about church going and the strength of institutions of specific denominations, there seems to have been noticeable decline in the last 20, maybe 30 years or so. Up until then, it seemed much more stable.
And then COVID came along. Most religious institutions had to shut their doors, at least for a time, and this created an opportunity elsewhere, a 24/7 opportunity.
So Pray.com is an app that has various prayer features, it has prayer content, and it has a sort of social network within it where people can pray together.
That is Emily Baker White. She's a staff writer at Forbes. Before that, she wrote for BuzzFeed News.
I would say I write about big tech policy, mostly.
She's written about privacy and propaganda issues at TikTok. She's written about the link between Instagram and eating disorders. Baker White doesn't consider herself religious, but she is interested in religious apps.
Just because religion is, for so many people, such an intimate thing and such a private thing. And there was a notable influx of venture capital sort of at the same time that piqued my interest and frankly, the interest of a number of reporters.
Baker White didn't set out to be a reporter. As an undergrad, she studied music, then went to Harvard Law School, then worked as a public defender in Philadelphia, trying to get inmates off death row.
I, at that point, had no idea that I would ever want to work in technology, cover technology. I'm not a tech person.
But while she was working on a case involving police brutality, she found that police officers were sharing a lot of information with each other on Facebook, some of it disturbing.
It seemed to me like a sort of glorification of violence against suspects, criminal suspects.
She got interested in how a site like Facebook was run. She stopped lawyering and wound up working at Facebook and also Spotify on internal policy. What she learned there is that a questionable or even damaging policy didn't get much attention until someone in the media critiqued it.
And so I think really watching the effect that journalism had made me want to do journalism.
So she made another career change. As a reporter, Baker White is particularly interested in what social media platforms and apps do with the user data they collect.
The idea of capturing such intimate information about users is new. And if you are totally cynical, it's super valuable. What's the most valuable intimate information I can get about people? Well, probably their medical records and also their prayers, right?
In early 2022, Emily Baker White wrote a piece for BuzzFeed News called Nothing Sacred. These apps reserve the right to sell your prayers. Coming up after the break, we'll find out what she learned. I'm Stephen Dubner. This is Freakonomics Radio. We'll be right back.
Freakonomics Radio is supported by Indeed, with tools like skills tests designed to help quality candidates show hiring managers what they can do. Learn more at Indeed.com/credit. And by Progressive Insurance, presenting Progressive's Name Your Price tool, which shows customers coverage options that fit their needs. More at Progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Georgia Public Broadcasting is proud to partner with NPR to bring the NPR Politics podcast back to Atlanta. Join Asma Khalid, Mara Eliason, Susan Davis, Tamara Keith, Miles Parks, and GPB's Stephen Fowler on October 20th at the Buckhead Theater. Doors open at 7 p.m. The show starts at 8. You can find more information about tickets, including student tickets, at nprpresents.org. We hope to see you there. Support for GPB programs comes from our listeners and Augusta Magazine, for over 40 years bringing readers a taste of all the Garden City has to offer in arts, history, gardens, personalities, local flavor, entertainment, and more. The best of Augusta. Subscriptions, AugustaMagazine.com. And Florida's Space Coast.